Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. There's still a few people logging in, so we're going to wait just a few more minutes. Hello, my name is Brian DiPaolo, and I'm the Director of Strategic Services for Accudata Systems. I will be moderating today's webinar. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our third bi-monthly PCI Qualified Security Assessor Open Forum. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few action items. First, because this is an open forum, feel free to ask questions through the chat window in your browser. We did receive some questions during the registration period, so we'll go through those first, and then we'll move on to the additional questions afterward. If you're unable to get your question answered today, we will respond personally to your questions through email. Please allow about 72 hours for our responses. After the webinar today, each attendee will receive a post-event email that includes a full recording of today's webinar, as well as a copy of the slides and some resources to help you with PCI compliance. Today we're joined by two extremely knowledgeable experts who've been working with PCI since it was announced. First, I would like to introduce Risk and Compliance Consultant John Fisher. John has been in the IT field for more than 20 years and is a certified PCI QSA. John routinely performs PCI ROC assessments for Level 1 merchants and service providers, and also has a strong background in application security. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Senior Technology Manager Josh Berry. Josh has been a QSA since 2010, also holds a CISSP and an Offensive Security Certified Professional certification. Josh has extensive experience with penetration testing, vulnerability management, as well as PCI ROC engagements also for Level 1 merchants and service providers. With that, we'll go ahead and get started today. We appreciate you joining us, and we'll move on to the first question. So with that, I'm going to jump to Josh, and let me over here to the first question. Does PCI 3.2 require Suite 2 be compliant security? Or I'm sorry, not compliant cryptography, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Josh.
So the short answer to that is no. The PCI DSS, all versions refer to the use of strong cryptography, and the Security Standard Council has a glossary on their website that specifically notes the use of AES 128-bit or above, triple DES with triple length keys and a number of other algorithms, and then references the NIST publications on cryptography, key strengths, and guidance for more information. NIST is really the source to use if you are looking at an encryption algorithm that's not specifically referenced in that glossary. John, do you have anything to add to that?
Nope, I think you pretty much covered that one. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. So I'll move on to the next question. So this one will go over to John. Does the completion of the SAQ for a level 4 merchant require assistance or attestation from a QSA?
Okay, thanks for the question. Generally speaking, it does not, unless you've been notified by your bank, and that usually is in reference to a breach that it requires attestation from a QSA, then it does not. And just for the record, if you've been notified by your bank or you know you've had a breach, you're going to be a level 1, which would require a full report on compliance by a QSA. Anything else, Josh?
No, that about covers it. The key is you're required to comply with all applicable controls, but you are not required to use a QSA to complete an SAQ.
Yeah, and one thing I would add as well, because we have customers come to us, and sometimes where they're not required to do a report on compliance, they will ask us as a QSA to provide some level of attestation, for various reasons, because they want to be able to show it to maybe their customers, or they want to have some additional confidence in the report. So that is typically optional. If there is a required attestation from your bank, that would typically have to go, or that would be typically in the form of a report on compliance. So I'll move on to the next question. So I'm going to go back to Josh. So this is a pretty open-ended question, but I'll let you jump in to start this. What are the new changes in PCI 3.2?
The primary changes were the requirement to document your cryptographic architecture in the event that you are storing cardholder data. It's actually specific to service providers. Updates to applying change control to significant changes within your environment. The requirement to use multi-factor authentication for access into the cardholder data environment. And then the remaining of these are service provider only, but having a logging and monitoring control in place that detects failures of other security controls, such as if your firewall stops logging or antivirus stops working correctly, that you have something in place to alert you to that. There were updates to penetration testing requirements, specifically more frequent segmentation testing for service providers. An update to document executive responsibility and sign-off for PCI controls, as well as security policy confirmation of those controls by executive management. Those are at a high level, those are some of the things that changed in 3.2. John, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I would like to mention that even though a lot of those changes were targeted to service providers, your merchant compliance for all you merchants on the webinar today absolutely relies on your service provider compliance. So for service providers that you happen to have to assess as part of your annual PCI assessment activity, you would have to take these new requirements for them into account. Now, hopefully your service providers are getting themselves assessed by a QSA, and that makes your job easier in that department.
Yeah, no, thanks for that insight, John. I guess back to maybe Josh on this specific question, when you were going through that list, is there any specific controls that stand out as, I guess, more significant or are going to require more effort on your part?
Sure. Depending upon the architecture of the environment, multi-factor authentication could take some time to integrate into the cardholder data environment and require some planning ahead, and there's the upfront cost if that isn't already in place of implementing something that adds a second factor for any access into that environment.
Thanks, Josh. Well, I'll move on to the next question. So one of the things that when we were talking about the things that are new in 3.2, there were a large number of the changes in 3.2 were best practice when it was released in 2016 and then future dated to being required as of February 1st of 2018. So I guess really because of that, I guess one question is, do I need to update my current ROC with the 3.2 standards if it was validated before January 31st, 2018?
Okay, so the answer is yes and no. So in terms of the PCI council or your acquirer, they're not going to ask for an updated ROC or SAC or self-assessment questionnaire before it's due on your next due date. However, it is your responsibility to make sure the controls are in place by the time that they said they were supposed to be, which is January 31st, 2018. So I guess that's a yes and a no. Josh, you want to clarify anything there?
No, that covers it. I think the key is that what you said is you're required to implement them, but you won't have to update an existing ROC.
Thanks, gentlemen. That provides some good insight. We are seeing again, this is all tied back to anniversary dates and in terms of attestation. So we are seeing a lot more questions from our clients and customers around the specific dates with their anniversaries coming up in 2018. So with that, I believe that covers all of the questions that were submitted during the registration period. It looks like we've had a question come in, so I'll point this back to Josh, and this is in line with the question that was just asked. What should I do if I will not be compliant before February 2018?
So the answer to that is it depends, but in any case, I recommend engaging a QSA if you haven't already done so, and starting to assess whatever gaps that you have. If PCI DSS is new to your company and your acquiring bank is requiring that you attest to an SAQ or a ROC before that time frame, then you will likely need to work with them on an extension. And I recommend using the council's prioritized approach to target how you implement the various controls that are not currently in place in the environment. And that's where a QSA can really help in determining a realistic time frame for getting those controls in place and getting a validated ROC and working with the acquiring bank and card brands. If you haven't previously completed an SAQ or a ROC, then you'll still need to work with a QSA to determine an accurate time frame for getting everything in place. Or another option is developing compensating controls in lieu of the new requirements.
Thanks, Josh. I guess one thought, so maybe going back to John, when you look at all of these controls and the evolution of PCI across the various versions, what is the theme we're seeing with the changes in 3.2?
You kind of cut out on me on the last part of that. Could you just ask the question itself one more time, please?
Oh, I apologize. So my question was, is there a specific theme that you're seeing with 3.2 and the changes that are now required as part of the standard?
Sure. Generally, the theme with the evolution of PCI, whether we're referring back to the earliest versions all the way up to 3.2, is it has evolved in response to breaches and what the counsel and security experts have learned typically cause those breaches. So in the case of the current PCI standard, it again, was in response to some of the major breaches that I'm sure all of y'all have heard about in the news. And so they've added, more strict controls around the service providers, because a lot of folks have tried to outsource more of their security environment to service providers. So in doing so, other things have happened with service providers, and therefore they've made those controls more strict. And in particular, the multi-factor authentication to access the cardholder data environment, as far as merchants go, or service providers for that matter. Again, like Josh said, that's probably going to be the most difficult, time-consuming one to implement, but it's now required. So if you haven't already got on that one, need to be taking a serious look at it. Does that answer your question, Brian?
Yeah, no, thanks for the insight, John. I think one of the things I know we've also seen is around just PCI there is less. In the beginning, we saw a lot of customers treat it as a final exam each year, and now we're seeing a lot more focus on the recurring controls and making sure those things stay in place throughout the year to ensure that you do stay protected. So I think this all aligns with the evolution of the standard. One last question that I would have is, we talked a little bit about the changes in PCI 3.2, and one of the things that has flown under the radar for some, or has been a surprise for some, is some of the changes with the requirements around iframe and redirect applicability. Josh, can you just provide some insight so those on the phone know what those changes are and how it would impact them?
Sure. So previously in the SAQs for iframe redirects, the controls were limited to primarily the physical security of any systems or even paper-based media containing cardholder data, as well as having applicable policies in place concerning the security of whatever cardholder data exists, whether it's paper-based or whatnot. And so it's very limited. They expanded those in some recent SAQ updates to include the vendor default accounts listed in requirement 2, as well as adding a few of the account and password controls in requirement 8.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying, Josh. I know that's been a surprise on occasion with some customers, based on it being rolled out a little bit under the radar in terms of how it showed up in the SAQs. Really, it appears that is all the questions that have been asked. With that, I'm going to thank you again for your time. I'm pleased would ask that you check our post-event email for additional resources, and feel free to contact us with additional questions, and we'll definitely get back to you. With that, we appreciate your time, and have a great day.